Greetings, everyone. This is John Contreras, and I'm coming to you from Los Angeles, and you are listening to my show, Greek News on Demand, which is patterned after my Greek news blog, GreekNewsOnDemand.com. We publish both in Greek and in English, and there we publish the biggest bombshell news items of the day, both about Greece, its relations with the United States, how it's affected by the New World Order. We cover also the world geopolitical scene, particularly with regards to how the New World Order is influencing that as well, along with the whole world for that matter, along with every nation of the world for that matter. And I want to thank the Patriot Radio online radio network, UCY.TV, for hosting this show. And we air every Saturday at 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 2 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Again, you are listening to Greek News on Demand. So, this radio broadcast is dedicated not only to Greece, but, of course, to America, because I'm an American citizen. I was born here. It's also devoted, of course, to all the freedom-loving nations of the world out there. And my angle, my slant here is exposing the New World Order via the Greek route. And I've spoken many times before why that is so. Because the onset of the New World Order, in other words, started with the fall of the great Greek Christian Byzantine Empire. And this has been written about and verified for hundreds of years by some of the greatest scholars on the face of the earth. One of whom is none other than Eustace Mullins, the greatest New World Order writer that ever existed. He was, of course, the protege of the great poet and writer Ezra Pound, who years and years ago, from like almost the turn of the century on, wrote the most revealing poems and books, exposing, of course, the Zionist Jewish control over America and the whole world, for that matter. And Pound, of course, escaped America right before World War II, for obvious reasons, because he was an anti-war activist. And, of course, he went to Italy, where he had a radio program, oddly enough, for several years. And then after the war, he was, of course, captured and then extradited back to the United States, okay, where he never stood trial for anything. He was never accused of anything because the government knew that he spoke the truth. And what did he speak about? He spoke about the fact, not just through his radio program, but for years leading up to World War II, that the Federal Reserve Bank, for example, was the design of the Jewish international bankers from the House of Rothschild, okay? It was instituted illegally and was created for war finance and for manipulating our economy and so on and so forth. So, Mr. Ezra Pound, of course, was persecuted for this because when they bring him back to the United States, he, of course, sat in an insane asylum for 12 years without any charges. Luckily, it was Eustace Mullins who was able to get him out after 12 years, because Mullins, who at that time was a young up-and-coming writer, as well as an employee of the Library of Congress, okay, was able to meet Pound in St. Elizabeth's Hospital in Virginia, somewhere in Virginia, through a mutual friend. And because Pound saw that Mullins was very astute, a very bright young man, and also that he had access to all the government secrets there in the Library of Congress, because that's where they're all housed, for those that don't know. Okay? Pound, because of all this, decided to bequeath, to basically hand over the rights of his work to Mullins. And that's what Mullins did for the rest of his life. For over 50 years, he wrote many, many revealing books and articles exposing the New World Order. And his writings are of an invaluable importance for all of humanity, to say the least. So Ezra Pound gets out of his insane asylum after 12 years with Eustace Mullins' help. Eustace Mullins goes on to write the most prolific works about the New World Order. His book, The Secrets of the Federal Reserve, which he published, it was in 1952, is the authority on the subject concerning the illegal installation of the Federal Reserve Bank in America, which is no more federal than Federal X, on the part of the Jewish international bankers from the House of Rothschild. And many hearings in Congress took place leading up to it and then after it, exposing the fact that it was illegal 100%. So anyway, that's a long subject, and I'd like to do another broadcast on that later. But today what I'd like to do is first play you a clip of an old interview that Eustace Mullins gave to a local, I believe it was, Texas TV station in 1992, where he talked about the New World Order. And he talks a little bit, of course, too, about the fall of the Greek Byzantine Empire, which is very important for us Greeks, as well as for all those serious New World Order researchers out there that want to know the real cause behind the New World Order, why it started, and so on and so forth. There's still a lot of people who still don't know that the real cause of the decline, let's say, of Western civilization was none other than the fall of the great Greek Christian Byzantine Empire to the hands of the Ottoman Turks, world Jewry, and the black nobility from Venice. Okay? Read or watch, let's say, for example, a YouTube clip on Shakespeare's book, or play, rather, The Merchant of Venice, which talks all about that. Anyway, besides all that, then I want to get into basically some really pressing items concerning Greece's financial situation. I want to cover, too, a major development concerning the kidnapping of 2 Greek soldiers a few weeks ago by the Turks within Greek territory, and now Erdogan is using the imprisonment of these 2, the illegal imprisonment of these 2 Greek soldiers as a bargaining chip of the Greeks, because he wants to basically make a deal right now with the Greeks by trading these 2 Greeks soldiers for the 8 Turkish military officials that escaped Turkey almost 2 years ago during the coup that took place there. And ever since then, Erdogan and his government has suspected that these 8 Turks who have sought asylum in Greece played a major role in the coup, and he wants them, of course, extradited back to Turkey, because he obviously wants to try him and kill him, obviously. So now he's telling the Greeks, basically, look, I'll give you back your 2 Greek soldiers that they obviously kidnapped, and if you return back our 8 Turkish military personnel who are guilty, basically, of treason. So this is a huge issue pressing on Greece right now. There's also many other issues that are really pressing right now in Greece with regards to its financial situation. The international lenders are acting like Greece is gonna basically end this bailout, 8-year-long bailout program with the Troika, and everything's gonna go back to normal. Okay, like it was before this, long period of bailouts from the Troika. Nothing, of course, could be further from the truth. What these scoundrels want to do is keep Greece enslaved, and the way that they're going to do it, of course, is by continuing to monitor Greece's financial situation, even after the termination of these bailout programs, by telling the Greeks that if you want basically support from Europe in any way, you got to continue your fiscal reforms. You got to continue to sell off your public assets to pay your bills to the Troika, because Greece has lent a lot of money from them, and you have to continue to allow us to manage this special fund. It's a super type of fund which contains all of Greece's public assets, and which is basically going to belong to the Troika for the next 100 years. Okay? So they want control of that. They want to manage it for their own, obviously, selfish purposes, greedy reasons, We're dealing with the international monetary lenders who are cooperating, of course, with the Troika, which has been raping and robbing Greece for 8 years now through these fake bailout programs based on false pretenses, okay? And so on and so forth. I've talked to you many times about this, so we're going to get a little bit more in depth into this subject. And, of course, there's many other pressing issues right now in Greece, especially with regards to the fact that Turkey right now is speaking openly about war with Greece. So that's another huge subject. So let's cover this Eustace Mullins, this old Eustace Mullins interview, because it's very interesting, and it'll explain a lot to us about the New World Order and how it works today. So, Eustace Clarence Mullins Jr., he was born on March the 9th, 1923. He passed away February the 2nd, 2010. His best-known book is The Secrets of the Federal Reserve, in which he proved that a group of shadowy organizations had conspired to write the Federal Reserve Act for its own nefarious purposes and then induce Congress to enact it into law, and so on and so forth.
About several different subjects, but this particular subject is the most important for today's political venue. And Eustace has written a book called The World Order. Now, Mr. Mullins has been working for the last 50 years to research important questions that need to be answered in relationship of Middle America to the political evolution. Eustace, tell us a little bit, if you would, how you got started in being an author.
Well, I had always intended to be an author, but I had intended to write novels, perhaps some poems, and I had absolutely no interest in any research or any nonfiction work. I didn't consider that as creative writing. So I met a poet, a very bohemian person named Ezra Pound, who was then incarcerated without trial on a more or less lifetime basis. And he asked me to look into the banking interest, the Federal Reserve System, at the Library of Congress there in Washington, D.C. And I did this, and I found it to be quite an interesting story, which launched me on research which continues to the present day.
Now, this book, The New World Order, how does the New World Order deal with the banking interest in America and across the world?
Well, you see, in studying the banking system in the United States, I found it was part of an international system of banking called central banks in Europe, and that the Federal Reserve System, which we had here, was simply an American version of the central banks they had in Europe. And I also found that these banks did not exist as some entity in some world of their own. They were an integral part of what I came to call the world order.
Now, Eustace, this New World Order and this banking system, I was under the impression that the banks themselves were American banks and it was the federal government that owned the banks. Are you telling me that our government itself doesn't own these banks?
Well, our government doesn't own anything. We really don't have a government. We're just a colony of England.
How can you say that, a colony of England? Well, I know that they have the Republican Party and the Democrat parties, and I go down to the local bank and I can cash a dollar bill, can't I?
Oh, well, you can go into any colony of Great Britain and cash a check. That doesn't mean you're in an independent nation.
Would you trace for me the colony of Great Britain to the United States and the banks? If I put a Federal Reserve note in the bank today, how can I say or how can you tell me that's a part of a colony of Great Britain?
Well, you see, we started out as a colony of Great Britain, and then presumably we won political independence in the American Revolution. But you see, the American Revolution was not against the bank. The American Revolution was against King George III. So we won against King George III, but we didn't win against the Bank of England, of which King George III was a major stockholder. So King George lost this wonderful colony over here, but he retained the banking control and continued to get his interest and his profits from his American colony, just as before.
Okay, let's go from King George to the Federal Reserve. What happened in between? Because there was some time in there, and some people say that Andrew Jackson was one of the best presidents this country ever had. Could you tell us about him, and what did he do in regard to banking?
Well, you see, immediately after the revolution, when we had our wonderful independence and we could have the 4th of July and shoot off firecrackers and still pay interest to the Bank of England, which no one seemed to mind because they didn't know about it. And so Andrew Hamilton reestablished the Bank of England presence in the United States of America immediately after the revolution, called the First Bank of the United States, which Jefferson strongly opposed. And when Jefferson became president, he refused to renew the charter of this foreign central bank, the First Bank of the United States, so it went out of existence. And in revenge for that, England declared war on us, and we had the War of 1812, which was simply a banking war. Of course, you won't read that in any history book in England or in the United States. They tell you that American seamen were being impressed by the British Navy. They would stop American ships and impress American seamen. And this was the occasion of the war. Well, it had nothing to do with it. It was simply the Bank of England said, we're going to punish the United States for refusing to renew the charter of the First Bank of the United States. So anyway, the First Bank of the United States disappeared, and then Nicholas Biddle, an agent of James Rothschild of Paris, chartered a second Bank of the United States. And it was doing quite well until Andrew Jackson came along, and he said to the bankers, you are a nest of vipers, and by God, I will rout you out. And so he did. He removed all of the government deposits from the Second Bank of the United States in 1836, which caused it to collapse. And in revenge, the Bank of England suspended all American paper, which caused the first Great Depression in the United States, called the Panic of 1837. That was strictly a banker's panic, and of course then the Rothschilds came in and bought up American securities at 1 cent on the dollar and established a great many of the great American fortunes, including J.P. Morgan.
But Andrew Jackson himself, you would credit him with at least taking a stand against this banking monopoly that is destroying his America.
Well, he was a general and a patriot and an American, and to him the bankers were Satan incarnate. They were robbing and looting this country. They were oppressing the people. They were causing financial depression and widespread suffering, and he said, I'm going to go after them, and he did. Unfortunately, the history books do not tell you why he did anything that he did, so the American children go to school and they have no idea what all this was about. Neither do the college students. Neither do the graduate college students.
You know, I saw a beautiful statue of Andrew Jackson not long ago up in Jacksonville, Florida. And a lot of people don't realize that the state of Florida, the first governor was Andrew Jackson.
Yes, that's right.
And the city of Jacksonville was named after this wonderful patriot and hero of the American middle class. Now, let's go a little bit further. You mentioned the word Rothschilds. Where did that name come from, please?
Well, there was a family of moneylenders in Frankfurt, Germany, named Bauer, which means peasant. And why these moneylenders were trying to call themselves peasants, I don't know, because none of them had ever been near a plow in their life. And so they were moneylenders, and they needed some way of advertising their business, and so the founder of this dynasty, the House of Rothschild, put up a red shield above his door so that people who came from various parts of Europe to change money with him could find it. And so after a few years, people didn't know who Bauer was, but they knew the Rothschild. The red shield was Rothschild. And so he simply began to call himself Rothschild.
Okay, now he died eventually, but did he leave a dynasty of some sort? I mean, how did this happen?
Well, he left 5 sons who were very well trained by this man, who by that time had become the outstanding moneylender of Europe due to a very peculiar circumstance. King George III and the Bank of England wanted to punish the American colonists for being so obstreperous and for refusing to give all of their profits to the Bank of England from their income. And so when they rebelled, then the British Army did not really want to fight their American cousins. So King George said, well, I've got to get somebody else to fight this war. I need some mercenaries, some hired soldiers. And over in Germany, the Elector of Hesse, a German province, had a very well-trained group of soldiers called the Hessians. And so he said, well, I'll rent these out to you, King George, who was a German himself, by the way, of Hanover. And he said, for $5 million, you can have this nice army. And so George said, all right. And then when the elector of Hesse got this $5 million, he said, what am I going to do with it? And they said, well, there's a very good investor and financial advisor named Meyer Amschel Rothschild there in Frankfurt. So he lets Meyer Amschel lend out this money, which was the biggest chunk of capital in Europe at that time, $5 million. And so Amschel spread it around, and pretty soon he brought back $20 million to the elector, who was very pleased, and kept $5 million for his efforts. So now he was a monetary power himself, and of course the elector of Hesse let it be known that if you had money to invest, put it in Meyer Amschel's hands. So when Meyer died, he had 5 sons, and so they dispersed themselves over the 5 capitals of Europe, and Nathan went to London, James went to Paris, and so forth. So they now had total control of the monetary resources of Western civilization, the entire continent of Europe. And they had developed some very interesting techniques. One was that the courier went from James in Paris to Nathan Mayer in London, and he wanted $1 million in gold. So he would give him a note saying, I want $1 million in gold. But he would not sign it. So if someone came into a Rothschild office, a courier, and said, I have a request here for $1 million, it's signed James Rothschild, and Nathan knew it was fake because they didn't sign their communications.
Little trickery even then, but I think good little trickery.
Well, you live and learn, you know.
That's right. So we're talking about the New World Order. In the New World Order, we had the war with England, and that was the Revolutionary War. And there was the banking system that was set up, and that was Alexander Hamilton that set it up originally after that. Thomas Jefferson then went ahead and decided...
So I'd like to interject a little bit into this conversation with some other very powerful research from some British authors who lived back in the 17 and 1800s. Now, if you Google Jonathan Williams, Jonathan Williams, and then type in the book Legions of Satan, I believe it's 1873. No, I'm sorry, 1781. Okay. Jonathan Williams, Legions of Satan, published in 1781. So we read, just so, we have a little bit more background on the so-called Revolutionary War, right? And how basically it was nothing more than this whole, ruse. It was this whole fake war that was meant to basically trick the American people into thinking that after the war, if they were to defeat England, they would be free and so on and so forth, when in reality, they continue to be enslaved through the banking system. And of course, that still exists to this day. Okay? Which is what Eustace Mullins just described. So, Jonathan Williams recorded in his Legions of Satan in 1781 that General Cornwallis revealed to General George Washington during the signing of the Article of Capitulation signed by Cornwallis at Yorktown that, quote, a holy war will now begin on America, and when it is ended, America will supposedly be the citadel of freedom, but her millions will unknowingly be loyal subjects to the crown, end quote. Cornwallis went on to explain what would seem to be a self-contradiction. He says, quote, your churches will be used to teach the Jews religion, and in less than 200 years, the whole nation will be working for divine world government. That government that they believe to be divine will be the British Empire. All religions will be permeated with Judaism without even being noticed by the masses, and they will all be under the invisible all-seeing eye of the grand architect of Freemasonry, end quote. General Cornwallis to General Washington, as recorded by Jonathan Williams in his book, Legions of Satan, published in 1781. Okay, anyway, so going back to Eustace,
We're talking to Eustace Mullins, ladies and gentlemen, and we're talking about the New World Order. Well, tell us then, the Rothschilds, tell us about the Federal Reserve. Now they've become involved in the Federal Reserve, and what about Soviet Russia? How did Soviet Russia come into this New World Order situation, Mr. Mullins?
Well, Soviet Russia was always part of the world order, and in fact the Soviet Empire, the evil empire, which we heard so much about, and in the 1950s we were digging atom bomb shelters in our backyards to protect us from this catastrophe which was going to happen at any moment, and which was good for the contracting industry, but it didn't really help anybody as far as avoiding atomic bombs. So the Soviet Empire came about because of greed and envy. Now, communism, of course, is based on hatred, greed, and envy. But what people don't realize is that the Russian Revolution came about because of the greed and envy of King George V of England for his cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, who happened to be the richest man in the world. And when you're the richest man in the world, the consequence is all the people who are not quite as rich hate you and wish they could get their hands on your money. So the Rothschilds told King George V, they were all around him as his advisors in London, they said, look, let's go after Nick and get his dough. And George said, well, I'm game. And so the Rothschilds started the communist movement in Russia. And so they murdered the Tsar and his family and took his gold, which was sent to Paris and to Kuhn Loeb Company in New York and the other Rothschild offices, London and so forth. And some of this money, by the way, these Rothschild banks used to buy the original stock of the Federal Reserve System in 1914. That was all bought with the Tsar's money, and so the Romanov heirs, such as are still alive, are the real owners of our Federal Reserve System. And so, as I say, they murdered the richest man in the world, took all of his money.
Well, what year was that, by the way? What year was that when they murdered the Tsar?
Well, that was 1918. They had the Communist Revolution in 1917, and the first thing they did was go in and loot the whole country. They took all the money, and the result was the new Soviet Empire had no operating capital, and they couldn't tax anybody because they had murdered all the people who owned anything. So you couldn't go out and tax the peasants to keep the country running. So they sent up cries of anguish, and people all over the world responded. Woodrow Wilson, our president, he made a speech to Congress in which he said, "It is our duty to help these noble murderers in Moscow," in so many words. And so he first sent them $25 million of his personal war fund, voted to him by Congress to prosecute World War I. And he sent Elihu Root, who, by the way, wrote the charters of all the major foundations. Elihu Root was a lawyer of whom J.P. Morgan said, when I call in lawyers and I want something done, they give me a lot of reasons why it cannot be done. He said, when I call in Elihu Root says, what do you want me to do? And I tell him, and he does it. So that's why he became the lawyer for the big bankers in this country.
Now, tell me, Eustace, because there's a lot of people that have said that the banking themselves, that the communist revolution was started on Wall Street. Is that a true fact or not, Eustace Mullins?
It's absolutely true. All of the money for Wall Street, for the Bolshevik Revolution, came from Wall Street, really from Rothschild firms, but it would have been too obvious if the Rothschilds of London were sending all their money over to Russia to help the communists. So they did it through their favorite patsy, which is the American government. And they even formed a special firm on Wall Street in 1916 to finance the communist revolution in Russia, which was called American International Corporation. And its directors were Percy Rockefeller, the richest men in the United States, including a financier named George Herbert Walker, who just happened to be the grandfather of George Bush, our president.
Now, how does this George Bush fit in now? George Herbert Walker Bush, the former president, or about to be president of the United States, formerly anyway, how does he fit in with his father and was it his father and the Rockefellers and the Harrimans and the Brown brothers? Did they all work together as far as this New World Order is concerned?
Well, the New World Order is a group of insiders. It's sort of an international mafia, and they either work together or they get eliminated. I mean, these people have to cooperate because the death sentence is automatic if you don't. And you don't say, I'm going my way, to heck with you, because if you go your way is straight down. And so George Bush was like a lot of scions of these World Order families. That is, he was unemployable. I mean, if he came in to be interviewed, and there were 8 people there, he would be the 8th one that you would hire if you had to hire 8 people. And, Lyndon Johnson...
He should have had 7 others when he was running for President of the United States.
Well, it's too bad they didn't. Lyndon Johnson was quite a perceptive guy. He was a Texas redneck, and he came to Washington, and he looked at all these bright young men at the Central Intelligence Agency who were from the wealthiest families in the United States. They were there as a lark. They wanted to play James Bond, and their families would do... and as Lyndon said, he said the CIA is composed of scions of wealthy families whose families would never dare let them near the business because it would be dissolved within 6 weeks. So George Herbert Walker Bush, when he finished at Yale, and they said, well, should we put him in the family firm of Brown Brothers Harriman? They said, good God, no, we'll be in the breadlines within 2 months. So they said, let him go work. Let him do what everybody else does. Go work for the Central Intelligence Agency and travel around and have fun. So George went to work for the CIA. It's the only job he ever had, just like Bill Buckley, another scion of a wealthy family. Bill Buckley was hired by the CIA when he finished at Yale, Skull and Bones. We're talking about the Brotherhood of Death here, the Skull and Bones crowd, which Bill Buckley and George Bush and all of the partners at Brown Brothers Harriman were members of this Illuminati fraternity established in 1848 as the Russell Trust by Daniel Court Gilman, who also, by the way, later set up the charitable foundations. Gilman was on the board of all of these so-called charitable foundations, which were simply secret instruments of the world order.
Okay, so that was a good taste of Eustace Mullins. You can go to YouTube and find that particular clip if you type in must watch. In 1992, Eustace Mullins wrote this book. Or all you got to do is just type his name into YouTube or into Google, and you'll be able to find tons of videos of him. You'll also be able to find this particular one. I believe the name of the interview was Bobby Lee, if I'm not mistaken. So anyway, in my book, Hellenic Crisis, a crisis of conspiracy against the Greek people, I write in chapter 4, which has the subtitle, A Greek Crisis of an Age-Long Conspiracy Against the Greek People, how it was Eustace Mullins who revealed some pretty amazing stuff to us through his books about the fact that the onset of the New World Order took place basically hundreds of years ago with the fall of the great Greek Christian Byzantine Empire. So Mullins wrote many books about the New World Order, okay? U.S. government corruption, and so on and so forth. All of his books are housed, by the way, in the Library of Congress, from where Mullins got most of his data to write his books. The last time I did a search was like a few years ago in the Library of Congress, and all his books are there, by the way. His book, The Curse of Canaan, okay, which is another fantastic book. In this book, Mullins sums up just who the black nobility are, who I mentioned previously, and their relation to the Byzantine Empire, okay, the black nobility from Venice, where they came from originally and what they're doing in the world today. Now, they were a very powerful elite Jewish ruling class in Venice. Venice lasts for like hundreds and hundreds of years, from like 1,100 to like the 1800s, to the beginning of the 1800s. It was one of the most powerful empires on the face of the earth during this period, and it was a big contender, a big rival of the great Greek Christian Byzantine Empire. So Mullins writes in his book, The Curse of Canaan, page 10, the curse of Canaan, he says, was extended to the land which was named after him, the land of Canaan. The Canaanites themselves, the people of this land, became the greatest curse upon humanity, so they remain today. And so they remain today. Not only did they originate the practices of demon worship, occult rites, child sacrifice, and cannibalism, but as they went abroad, they brought these obscene practices into every land which they entered. Not only did they bring their demonic cult to Egypt, but known by their later name, the Phoenicians, as they were called after 1200 BC, they became the demonizers of civilization through successive epochs, being known in medieval history as the Venetians, who destroyed the great Byzantine Christian civilization, which I just mentioned, and later as the, quote, black nobility, end quote, which infiltrated the nations of Europe and gradually assumed power through trickery, revolution, and financial legerdemain, meaning financial fraud, and so on and so forth. So those are the words of Eustace Mullins, ladies and gentlemen, the greatest New World Order writer ever. He wrote a lot about the Greek Christian Byzantine Empire, and this is a theme that I always pound on whenever I do broadcasts on this network, whenever I do my shows on this network, because the forces that took down basically the great Greek Christian Byzantine Empire at that time, which was a moral preserving force in the world, which is the light to all of humanity, and so on and so forth, through the gospel of Jesus Christ and through the Hellenic culture. These very same forces are the ones that are controlling the world today. The New World Order today is composed of these Venetian black nobility families, okay, which permeated all of Europe. Okay, they wound up in Europe, or they wound up in Germany, in Bavaria, Germany, the seat of the Illuminati, okay, through the Guelph dynasty. The Guelphs then moved to England hundreds of years ago, and they became, of course, the Windsors, okay, but the Windsors are nothing more than these sinister families that I'm describing to you. So, notice how in the end of his book, of the quote of this book here, he says that these forces specialize, let's just say, in financial legerdemain. As the readers in my book will see further, as you read my book, you'll see that these very same methodologies are the same ones that were used against Greece leading up to the financial collapse in 2009. In other words, leading up to their submission under the Troika in 2009 under false pretenses. Greece never really collapsed. They were just taken over financially, okay? They made up this whole thing about them having a $4 billion debt and a high deficit, which basically then called for, which was used as a pretext to put Greece under the control of the Troika, the European Central Bank, the European Commission, and the IMF, International Monetary Fund. So, in Mullins' other book, titled The World Order, he states the following, further expounding on this subject of the black nobility and how forces from Venice devolved and evolved from ancient times to modern times. And so he writes in The World Order, page 260 to 261, it has taken centuries of patient effort from the world order to attain the power it exercises today. Its origins as an international force go back to the Phoenician slave traders. This is very key. Continues through the Phanariot families of the Byzantine Empire, or you can say Phanariotes, or just spell Phnariot, and put in Byzantine Empire, and you can read more about that. Anyway, continuing. Then the Venetian and Genoese traders and bankers of the Middle Ages, who moved into Spain and Portugal, and later into England and Scotland. By the 14th century, the Genoese, Genose, controlled the Scottish landlords. The imperial family of the Byzantine Empire, the Paleologs, okay, spelled Paleologues, were attacked by the Gnostic faction, whose materialistic Aristotelian philosophy was the forerunner of the Hegelian dialectic in Marxism. The Paleologs devoutly believed in the Christian faith, as expressed by the Orthodox Rite. The materialistic Venetian and Genoese armies, with the aid of the Turkish infidels, looted and conquered Constantinople, the legendary city of God. That was the capital, ladies and gentlemen, of the Byzantine Empire. Today it's called Istanbul. Istanbul is also, by the way, a Greek word. It comes from the Greek Estinipolis. In other words, in English, it is the city. Okay, the great city. In other words, this is the great city of Constantinople. Is what it's saying, actually. So the Byzantine survivors, continuing, the Byzantine survivors recreated their culture in Russia, with Moscow as the quote-unquote Third Rome. The plan to destroy the Orthodox Church and its Romanov New Rome leader was the hidden goal of the First World War. The victors came away with $1 billion of the Romanov fortune after achieving the defeat of their hated enemy, the Orthodox Church. So as you just heard from Eustace Mullins, okay, both from that broadcast he was in, as well as from this excerpt from his book, the New World Order basically wanted to take down Christian Orthodox Russia, along with its Romanov dynasty. Why? Because they were a moral preserving force in the world. Not only that, they were the last bastion, okay, the last remnant of the great Greek Christian Byzantine Empire. Okay, the Russians took over for us the empire when we fell to the Turks in 1453. So that's very, very significant. And so that's precisely the reason why the sinister forces of the New World Order took out the Romanov dynasty and eliminated it, and stole all their fortune, of course. And they used its fortune to basically build their own fortunes, to build upon their already existent fortunes, and so on and so forth. Now, to verify all this, especially on the part of the New World Order itself, okay, I want to point out an article from EIR, which is like the media group of the famous Washington journalist Lyndon LaRouche, okay? This is an article published in their newspaper, EIR, in May of 1986 by a writer of theirs named M.T.U. Farson, where he goes into a bit of detail on the actual origins of the political school of thought from where Henry Kissinger was, let's say, reared for his own political career. Farson states in the beginning of this article the following, okay, and please take note of the names and personalities here. And he says, as the London Economist of the week of May the 3rd, 1986 put it, everybody who is anybody from the Rothschilds and the Aga Khan to Mr. Henry Kissinger and Europe's more decorative royals was gathering in Venice during these days. The occasion was the reopening of a restored Palazzo Grassi, an erstwhile plotting place for the Venetian oligarchy, which had recently been purchased for $15 million by Kissinger intimate Gianni Agnelli, that's spelled Agnelli, of the Fiat Corporation in Turin. Turin is spelled Turin. And in another part of the same article, he writes, indeed, for Kissinger, the whole experience was more a return to the roots, quote unquote, than a trip to the future, quote unquote. Kissinger's whole geopolitical ideology was concocted in Venice among the old families of the misnamed Venetian Republic. Venice became the center of intrigue, assassination, chicanery, double-dealing, etc., the kinds of practices that Kissinger has become notorious for, albeit practicing them in a much cruder way than his ancestors. In his Harvard doctoral thesis, A World Restored, written in the 50s, Kissinger more or less admits this in his praise for the Venice-manipulated 1815 Congress of Vienna. Similarly, today, Kissinger is one among many would-be grand strategists, quote unquote, in the United States who would hope to see the United States adopt Venetian methods, quote unquote, in the conduct of its foreign policy and intelligence evaluations. And this is precisely what's taken place over the past 4 or 5 decades, or more actually, with Kissinger. This is exactly what's taken place. So here at this conference in Venice, okay, you see Kissinger get together with the Rothschilds and other elites. Why? Because they are all, in other words, the successors of the Venetian black nobility, ladies and gentlemen. That's why. And if you know Kissinger's history, political history, you'll know the evil that he has done to Greece. Because it was him, of course, in conjunction with England, who crafted a plan to allow the Turks to invade the northern part of Cyprus in July of 1974, which has led to a 40-plus year long illegal occupation there on the part of the Turks. Why? Because the New World Order does not want Cyprus and Greece uniting, and this is one of the ways where they have prevented unity between these two Greek nations. The Greeks and the Cypriots are both Hellenic. They are both Greek, in other words. Okay? 1/3 of Cyprus today has been illegally occupied by Turks, the northern part of the island. And this is a violation of international law, etc., UN treaties, etc. And yet the United Nations no one has basically told the Turks to get the hell out of Cyprus. Okay, which needs to happen here and now. It hasn't happened yet, and this is just indicative of the fact that the United States has basically violated Greece's sovereignty and is working to destroy it, to allow the Turks to take it over, and so on and so forth. Why? Because the Greeks are the light of the world. They once ruled the world for over 1,000 years with the great Greek Byzantine Empire. The Hellenic culture is the light of all humanity. All of humanity is based on the Hellenic culture. All Western languages are a subset of Greek, and so on and so forth. That's why. And if the Greeks become powerful again in order to rule the world, then they will be a force to be reckoned with. Okay, the New World Order will not be able to stop them because they will have become so powerful again, just like they were in the past. And that's not what the New World Order wants. The New World Order wants to plunge the world into misery, into chaos, into darkness. They want to destroy humanity, okay? Whereas the Greeks want to build up humanity and make humanity great again. So, before I close, just to bring you up to speed what's going on in Greece. So as I mentioned at the beginning, about a few weeks ago, 2 Greek soldiers were kidnapped, okay, at the borders between Greece and Turkey. They were obviously on the Greek side in an area called Evros. According to top Greek political military analysts, the Turks crafted a plan by which to secretly invade Greek territory at the borders there between Greece and Turkey, kidnap some Greek soldiers, and then scuttle them away, basically, back into Turkish territory, and then accuse them of violating Turkish space. In other words, according to the Turks, it was these two Greek soldiers who violated Turkish territory by entering into it illegally, when in reality the exact opposite took place, according to the evidence. So now Erdogan is using this basically as a bargaining chip with the Greeks. He's telling them, give us back the 8 Turkish conspirators, okay, coup conspirators that tried to overthrow me in July of 2016. And, of course, I will give you back your 2 Greek soldiers, okay? Now, this is a very, very sinister plot, to say the least. But this, however, was already revealed to Greece and to the whole world, for that matter, back in November of 2010 through some then Wikileaks leaks, okay, which had to do with some secret U.S. military documents which concern Greece and Turkey. So this you will find very, very interesting, to say the least. So, we read from the Greek news website, the Greek Reporter, okay, in an article of theirs published on the November 30th, 2010. The following, that's GreekReporter.com, that's the full URL. We read the following unbelievable information here, okay? Concerning, of course, concerning Greek-Turkish relations, also concerning that region of Greece where these 2 Greek soldiers were kidnapped. And it quotes, and I quote, WikiLeaks published an article relevant to bilateral relations between Greece and Turkey. According to leaked documents, the American embassy in Ankara, Turkey, insists that Turkey planned to cause a convulsion at the Greek abuttals in order to invade the north side of Evros, the area which I just described to you. The document came into publicity the last days. It says that the executive officers know that a coup d'etat will be incited. So they made scenarios which would justify their actions. This document is extremely important. After its publication, the U.S. confirmed an attack was about to be conducted against Greece in 2003. In addition, they imply that the Turkish army will continue to cause such convulsions in their relationship with Greece. So this, again, was the Greek Reporter quoting WikiLeaks back in November of 2010. Why is this important? Well, because in this article and in these WikiLeaks, we read, ladies and gentlemen, that the Turks will try to invade Greece, okay, in that very same region, Evros, which I just described to you, where these 2 Greek soldiers were actually kidnapped a few weeks ago. So therefore, what we see here, okay, from WikiLeaks, which leaked to us back in, again, 2010, secret U.S. government military documents, we see a secret plan, ladies and gentlemen, by the Turks to invade Greece. This is what we're seeing here, which is now, of course, in full effect right now, apparently, with the kidnapping of these 2 Greek soldiers, as well as with the Turks' daily threats. Now, in the past several months, though, the Turks have really ramped up the ante with their provocative actions against the Greek state. They have rammed Greek boats in the Aegean. They are flying into Greek airspace like never before. They already do that, okay? And so on and so forth. So, in other words, back then, okay, the U.S. government knew that the Turks were planning basically on invading Greece. And according to WikiLeaks, this was a plot called Sledgehammer, and this actually dates back to 2003. So WikiLeaks gives us an excerpt of a U.S. military document. Okay, this is published by not only the Greek Reporter but by other major publications. And this excerpt says, Sledgehammer, the latest alleged plot, was allegedly drafted in 2003 by the Turkish pirate army under its then commander, General Setin Dogan. The plan, which has been denied by both the military and retired General Dogan, involved false flag bombings of mosques. Notice the key word there, false flag. And efforts to provoke a military crisis with Greece in order to create the conditions for military intervention into Greece. The plan, as revealed by Taraf on January the 20th, a day before the Constitutional Court's decision overturning the law allowing civilian jurisdiction over certain offenses committed by the military, allegedly included lists of names of politicians and journalists to be arrested, as well as names of politicians who would serve in a new government after the removal of the Turkish party AKP. And so what this American document, this U.S. military document is referring to is none other than the secret NATO program called Cosmic NATO, okay, which has been in effect for years. And according to Wayne Madsen and other top journalists, this secret program unites all of the deep states of all the member nations of NATO together, secretly. Israel is involved in this too, okay? And Turkey, of course, is involved in this. And this is a secret program, okay? This is run by the deep state in Turkey, which basically overturns governments, which creates coups, and so on and so forth, okay? So this is what we just read now with this excerpt. And, of course, this is a secret program, too, that, from what the evidence shows, sought to, of course, bring instability in Greece, as well as provoke war between Greece and Turkey. So, anyway, that was my program for today. You were listening to a broadcast of the show Greek News on Demand. That is Greek News on Demand. Please visit our website, GreekNewsOnDemand.com. That's one word, GreekNewsOnDemand.com, to read all of our latest articles in Greek and in English on Greece, as well as other major geopolitical events and how this all ties in with the New World Order. This is John Couture signing out. Please visit also my landing page, johnkouturis.com. That's spelled JOHNKOUN as in Nancy, T as in Tom, OURIS.com. And there you can learn more about me and the work I do as a journalist and an activist. And please support my work by getting my 2 books, Your Academic Guide to the Greek Language, Culture, and Civilization. And the other one is Hellenic Crisis, A Conspiracy of Crisis Against the Greeks. By, of course, yours truly, John Couturis. Thank you so much for listening.